You'd be forgiven for forgetting about Wex Pyke, one of the many minor characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. But such is the death spiral of late-stage A Song of Ice and Fire discourse that I've managed to cobble together a 20-odd minute video comprised entirely of theories about him. My last video about Rickon and Skagos tried to explain a couple of the unanswered questions around Wex, namely why he chose to follow Osha and Rickon, how he knew where they were going, and why he went to Wyman. However, maybe the answers I came up with aren't satisfying to you. Maybe you think there are other mysteries surrounding him that warrant an exploration. Maybe you're now so hooked on tinfoil that you can't survive without regular injections of horse tranquilizer. If any of those apply, come join me on a lovely theoretical adventure. First, let's do a quick reminder of Wex's story in the series. We meet him in Theon's first chapter of Clash, when Theon buys the horse Smiler off Lord Sylvain Botley. As part of the deal, Theon takes Wex, the bastard son of one of Lord Botley's brothers, as his squire. Wex then follows Theon on his harebrained schemes of raiding the north and capturing Winterfell. He continues to serve Theon until he disappears from the story when the Boltons sack Winterfell and kill all the Ironborn. In this Clash section, which is the vast majority of Wex's page time, we would not necessarily find him that mysterious. His most noteworthy feature is that he was born mute. Supposedly, at least. We'll come back to that later. Then, however, he shows back up at the end of Davos 4 in Dance, and we learn that he survived the sack of Winterfell by hiding up the Heart Tree, overheard the discussion of the survivors, followed Osha and Rickon, figured out they were going to Skagos, and then told Wyman. We the reader are left to wonder how and why any of this happened. I've got a lot of theories to talk about, most of them mutually exclusive. Quick disclaimer, as we all know on some level, the most likely situation here is that there isn't anything weird going on. Wex's story as told by Robert Glover and Wyman and Manderly is true, and any oddities or anomalies are not clues that there's more than meets the eye, but instead are just a result of having to somehow get Wex from the sack of Winterfell to White Harbour and cutting a few corners to get there. With that said, let's get into a series of theories that could all be put on an iceberg of who is Wex working for. First, let's have a look at Wex is working for Varys. Jose Sanchez in the comments of the last video raised this one. There's two main points for it. The first is that Wex is a mute child, and Varys uses mute children, his little birds, as his agents. Now, we're told that Wex was born mute via Theon's thoughts, which presumably comes from Lord Botley, which contrasts a bit with Varys' MO, which seems to be cutting tongues out, though Botley could be lying about the cause of Wex's muteness or mistaken. Still, Wex supposedly doesn't know how to read or write, which could raise the question of how he would convey any information to Varys, if indeed he was working for him. As Theon notes though, Wex is as clever as any 12-year-old had a right to be, a line which is going to do a lot of heavy lifting in these theories, by the way. So perhaps he can read and write, but is pretending to not be able to. After all, there is an odd thing with Wex's learning to write. Robert says that he only knows yes and no, but that this is enough to be going on with. Except that communicating in this way doesn't make much sense, as you wouldn't need to write yes and no, you could just nod or shake your head, which would be much quicker. So there's something fishy going on there. The second point in favour of the Varys theory is that Varys likes stashing away important people for use in his schemes. He supposedly did it with Aegon, and definitely did it with Tyrion and Jon Connington, and we can expand this to the fact that he's working with the Golden Company, which is a collection of exiles and sons of exiles with useful claims on various seats. Jaime also speculates that Varys might have hidden Tyrek away somewhere. With all this in mind, the fact that Wex is a mute child who has information on a missing claimant to a major house who is safely tucked away off the continent might ring a few alarm bells. Some people answer the riddle of why Rickon ended up on Skagos by saying that maybe someone put him there for safekeeping. Sometimes the someone in question is Wyman, but this raises a bunch of other questions that don't have easy answers. Varys is perhaps a more understandable candidate. The main problem with this theory is the methods. Varys undoubtedly must have agents outside of King's Landing, but the Little Birds network is only ever mentioned in reference to the capital. He had his mice in Pentos, but again that was a spy network centred in the city he was based in. It's unclear whether he even has any birds outside of King's Landing. Moreover, how would Varys have recruited Wex, and if he did tuck Rickon away somewhere, how did he do that? The why is perhaps easier to answer. Varys' general plan of sowing chaos would be aided by yet another northern uprising, with bonus points if it's helped by one of the key rebels, Davos. But the logistics might prove too difficult to explain. Moving on from Varys, let's go for something a little more reasonable. Wex is working for Wyman. Yeah, stunning revelation, I know. This is more of a what Wex does next theory. We assume that some variation of the story we're told is true. This is one of the theories that doesn't completely contradict my last video, so I'll headcanon that as justifying why Wex ended up working for Wyman in the first place. The question then becomes what role Wex will play in the story going forward. The most simple version would be Wex joining Davos on his voyage to Skagos, which would be a good idea given that he knows what Rickon and Osha look like, whereas Davos doesn't, and also is probably a pretty good sailor. Another option though would be for Wex to go with Wyman to Winterfell. Now, you might say, hang on, that's a bit reckless, isn't it? Ramsay would recognise Wex if he saw him, given that they lived in the same castle for weeks. And yes, it would be pretty reckless. But Wyman is pretty reckless, as evidenced by the whole Frey pie thing, because Wyman probably didn't kill, butcher and prepare those 3 Freys himself. How many cooks and guards do you think know that their liege lord has gone full Jeffrey Dahmer on the Freys? More than is sensible. So Wyman might be willing to let Wex tag along. He could be very useful. His testimony might be instrumental in convincing the other lords of what Ramsay did. He might know where Theon got the fake Bran and Rickon from. He might be able to scrounge up other evidence of Ramsay's crimes. He might know that all the women and children were marched off to the Dreadful. Or he might be useful in getting Theon to trust Wyman and testify against Ramsay. Then there's the possibility that Wex might have wanted to go along, and might have threatened to not help Wyman unless he was allowed to. Wex could have several axes to grind, with Ramsay and the Boltons for killing the Ironborn, or with Theon for leading them to their deaths. And Wyman is knee-deep in a revenge fantasy of his own, so he might be amenable to Wex's thinking. The things that happen in Winterfell could be seen as effects of this. Barbary Dustin going along with Theon to check the crypts, noting that one of the dead kings is missing his sword. Was she on the lookout for that? If so, that information presumably came from Wex, who could have noticed the old rusty swords the Starks were carrying. Of course, this info could have reached Barbary via Wyman, but remember that Wex's writing skills are supposedly limited, and Robert says it will take time to teach him, time Wyman likely doesn't have before he needs to set off for the wedding, so bringing Wex with him gives him a better chance of finding these things out. But where this theory really gets going is what else Wex might be doing in Winterfell. Remember I said he'd have some axes to grind with Ramsay or Theon? Well, there's some other people who betrayed the Ironborn and therefore Wex might have some beef with. The Walder's Frey. Wex would know that Freys, particularly Little Walder, the big one remember, who joined Wex and Theon on the hunt to find the escaped Bran and Rickon. And given their treacherous nature, first abandoning the Starks and then the Ironborn, they wouldn't be top of Wex's Christmas card list. They might even have been among those searching for him after the sack of Winterfell. It would make sense for the Boltons to press them into service for this purpose, as the Walders would know what any surviving Ironborn looked like, and might even have been able to trick them into revealing themselves. And of course, the main play here is that Little Walder is murdered, and we don't know who did it. Practically everyone in Winterfell has been accused of this at one point or another. Perennial candidates including the Spearwives, Big Walder, Ramsay, Roose, or even a split personality Theon. But what if what Big Walder says is actually true? It was one of Wyman's men who did it. After all, Wyman stands to gain quite a lot from the murder. It leads to him and the Freys being sent out of Winterfell, where he can exact his revenge upon them away from the watchful eye of the Boltons, which, by the way, is pretty much explicitly said in the conversation between him and Hostine. And although Wyman has lots of soldiers at his command, they might be a little hesitant about being told to butcher a 9-year-old in cold blood. As Barbary Dustin says, night work is not night work, which looks better written down, and how can Manderly be sure they won't tell anyone? Best to entrust it to the mute kid who likely already has reason to hate them. And what does Big Walder tell us about where Little Walder was going? He was owed money at dice, and it was the Manderly men who taught dice. And what is Wex doing the first time we meet him back in Clash? Why, dicing of course, and winning at it, maybe suggesting he's good enough to teach it. Of course, this theory conflicts with most of the others about the death of Little Walder. Though not necessarily all of them. We know that Big Walder wants to inherit the twins, and that has led some to suggest that he might have killed his cousin in order to move up the line of succession. But others have rightly pointed out that he's so far down that this doesn't make much sense, Big Walder is never realistically going to inherit the twins by dynastic succession, no matter how much familicide he commits. But there is a way that he could be involved in this, a way that might explain the irregularities in the murder, mainly that he is covered in blood even though the blood from Little Walder is frozen, and that Big Walder seems hesitant about the story he's telling. What if the Walders were lured away after beating some Manderly men at dice and met Wex, who proceeded to murder Little Walder? Then another Manderly agent, who knows, maybe Manderly himself, offers Big Walder a deal. Get Hostine to bring Little Walder into the Great Hall at the right moment, accuse the Manderlys in a vague and unconvincing way, to which Wyman will deliberately provoke the phrase, instigating a fight which will force Roose to send them both out of the castle. In return, Big Walder will be aligned with the Manderlys as their candidate to inherit the twins after the war is over. The only big problem with this theory is how Wex logistically fits into it. Was he dicing with the Walders, and if so, how come they don't recognise him? Well, they only knew him for a couple of weeks 2 years ago, and he's grown up a bit since then, and GRRM has a thing about people not recognising other people when probably they should, so maybe it's fine. If that's too much of a leap for you, though, then fair enough. Though, if that is too much of a leap, maybe switch off now before we get into Wex is working for the old gods. Bit weird, I know, but consider that Wex spends possibly days hiding in a weirwood tree. And not just any weirwood tree, but the heart tree of the Godswood in Winterfell, the one that Bran connects to from all the way beyond the wall to see through time, uses to speak to Theon and probably also Ned, and which by the way is apparently immune to fire and has just received a healthy blood sacrifice from Maester Luwin. Consider also that Wex is inexplicably not found by Ramsay and his people, even though they probably have dogs, knowing Ramsay, and even more egregiously that these forces don't even find Maester Luwin, who is lying beneath the weirwood tree, and Wex claims that the Boltons searched the Godswood and killed the men they found there twice. I mean, maybe they assumed Luwin was dead, but you'd think on the second time round they'd notice he wasn't rotting, or had moved a bit, or was breathing, or something like that. And none of them thought to climb the trees? This is Ramsay we're talking about, who hunts humans for sport on the regular. Climbing trees in a wood is the first thing he would be thinking about. Now, our current strategy is to say, yeah, whatever, GRRM just wanted Wex to survive and we just have to accept the kind of silly way he managed to do it. But what if in fact Wex, and Maester Luwin, were being protected by the weirwood somehow? Animals are sensitive to magic, and perhaps Ramsay's dogs were repelled or even warged by Bloodravens / Bran from the future / the old god / Hot Pie on Podrick's shoulders, whichever eldritch tree deity you prefer. There is possibly some precedent for this in the Isle of Faces, which, despite being an island smack dab in the middle of Westeros and a short swim from Harrenhal, somehow remains basically uncontacted by the rest of the continent. Aside from yet more awful skullduggery, this could suggest a kind of repelling magic at work. Nothing too crazy, just the kind of magic where if you try to go to the Isle, the closer you get, the more you think twice about it, and eventually decide to leave, that kind of thing. Also, remember that when Robert asks Wex how he survived, he draws a picture of a tree with a face. Upon hearing this, Davos asks, the old gods saved him? Robert kind of dismisses this, but what if Davos, good old simple yet usually right Davos, is bang on the money here? After all, Wex didn't just draw a tree, he specifically drew a tree with a face. What would this mean then, if Wex spent days hiding in a tree as future Bran whispered in his ears and kept the dogs and direwolves from noticing him? Well, what would you do if a tree god saved your life? Maybe listen to the tree god, and if it asks a favour, be happy to oblige? Maybe that's why Wex followed Rickon, rather than trying to make it to the Ironborn held places, or tracking the more valuable Bran. Maybe the old gods, here again just a catch-all for whoever or whatever is at work here, told Wex to protect Rickon, keep him safe. And maybe right now Wex is still working for the old gods. He seems changed from when we saw him last. His eyes are older than his body, and he is a little crueler, particularly to Davos, whose upcoming trip to Cannibal Island he seems to take delight in. But then, a vessel for the old gods would have little sympathy for the man who serves the R'hllor-worshipping weirwood-burning Stannis. Moving on somewhat from the magical realm, but not really, what about Wex is working for Euron? Euron likes his mutes. He supposedly crews his ship the Silence with them. He also has previously given a mute to a family member, perhaps to spy on them, in the case of Victarion and the Dusky Woman. Think back to how Wex ended up in Fion's service. Lord Botley gave him to Fion as part of selling him a horse. Fion remembers that Botley seemed happy to get rid of the horse, which he attributes to the horse being too difficult for Botley to manage. But perhaps he was less happy to get rid of the horse and more happy to get rid of Wex. After all, this is the same Lord Botley who is outspoken against Euron, claiming that the Seastone chair is Fion's, not Euron's, for which Euron kills him. Maybe Botley was reluctantly forced by Euron or his agents to give Wex to Fion. Or maybe Wex was spying on Botley for Euron, and Botley was trying to get rid of Wex for that reason. This might give Botley a reason to lie if Wex did indeed have his tongue cut out rather than being born mute. He didn't want Fion to suspect that he was pawning off one of Euron's agents. How much control Euron actually has over his mutes is uncertain. He has Shade of the Evening and maybe glass candles, and is weird and mystical and magical. If he's engaging in some kind of mind melding with Wex, then it could explain some oddities. Maybe Wex knows where Rickon is because Euron saw it on one of his drug trips. Maybe Wex seems clever to Fion and his eyes seem old because it's actually Euron looking out of them. Also, some people theorize about the big magical battle between Bran and Euron as opposing students of Bloodraven. And if this is getting too much for you, don't worry, it's almost over. But maybe Wex was sent to keep an eye on Bran, perhaps if Euron suspected that he might be an enemy for the future. But why then follow Rickon instead? Well, love is the death of duty, and plenty of stories have moments where the villain threatens the hero's loved ones in order to get them to surrender. A Song of Ice and Fire has this as well, with Ned for example. Sometimes it doesn't work because the hero is too much of a stone-cold bitch, like the Blackfish being unmoved by Edmure on the gallows. Other times it does, like Edmure checking the weather forecast and seeing light showers of newborn children. If Euron can get hold of Rickon and threaten him to get Bran to give in, would his threat work? Perhaps Book 7 detached tree god Bran wouldn't care, and Euron's final defeat would come from assuming his enemy was more compassionate than him. But whatever, maybe this is too much magic for your medieval political drama, and you want to get back to a good old-fashioned conspiracy. Well, to round out this video, Wex is working for the Boltons. After all, barring magical shenanigans, Wex's ability to dodge the Boltons searching for him is hard to justify, especially with Luwin surviving, which clashes with Wex's account. So what if the reason Wex survived was because the Boltons let him? Perhaps Wex was working with them, from even before the sack, and continues to do so. What's the evidence for this? Well, any alliance would have to have been struck up when Ramsay is in Winterfell masquerading as Reek. Ramsay could perhaps have reached out to Wex, since he knows Wex can't tell anyone about his secret identity. We know they must have spoken at least once, since they both arrived to wake Fion up when Asher comes to visit. Given that Wex would have just seen how Asher's couple dozen ironboard wasn't going to be the saving grace they'd hoped for, this could have been the moment when Ramsay promised Wex a way out of this death trap, and anything else on top of that Wex might want. And in return, all Wex needs to do is somehow keep the Northerners from taking Winterfell until Ramsay can get to the Dreadfort and back. After all, if the Northerners capture Winterfell, Ramsay can't surprise attack them, since they'd be inside the castle. But how on earth could Wex possibly do this, you ask? He's a 12-year-old squire. What influence could he exert to achieve this goal? Except, that is exactly what he does do, in a surprising way, for reasons which are unknown. You see, at the end of Clash, the Northern army are camped outside Winterfell. Inside, Fion devises a plan that might buy him time for Reek, aka Ramsay, to get back with some troops. He'll threaten to hang Beth Castle if her dad, Sir Roderick, attacks. However, this plan needs more than just Fion to pull off. He can't be awake 24/7, and if it's literally just him in the castle, then the Winterfell folk will probably do him in, and hell, he needs someone to put the noose around Beth's neck while he's chatting with Roderick. Normally this wouldn't be an issue, but Fion has only a few dozen ironborn. On the morning of his parley with Roderick, he calls them together, draws a line in the sand, and asks who among them will stand by him. And for a very long time, nobody does. If this is how it ends, and Fion loses all his troops, then they'll just scarper, as for example Asher's men and some of Fion's end up doing, and Fion will be left entirely on his own, at which point he'll either be killed by the small folk or surrender and hope to take the black, meaning Ramsay's plan to kill Roderick's troops and capture Winterfell will be foiled. And Wex is the person who makes sure this doesn't happen. He steps across the line and joins Fion, not especially happily, but he does do it, And what with him being a 12-year-old mute, this shames about a dozen more Ironborn into doing the same, which is enough for Theon to hold the castle that one more day that gives Ramsay time to get back. The thing is, why Wex chooses to do this is unclear. It's not like Theon is nice to Wex. He doesn't set a good impression by dragging him out of an inn by his ear and then beating him in Theon's first chapter, and then over the course of class shows himself to be a petty, vindictive, useless, child-murdering waste of space. Why would Wex accept a death sentence to defend this vain outsider, who had led him and his countrymen on a foolish suicide mission? In all likelihood, it's an intriguing little character moment for a quaternary character, and maybe some kind of commentary on the feudal system and the deference of lower classes to upper classes regardless of merit in general. But we're not here for literary analysis, we're here for mad theories. So, Wex is working for the Boltons. How does this play into his tracking down of Osha and Rickon, his alliance with Wyman, and so on? Well, if all the Boltons were offering him was his life, perhaps once he had that, he abandoned them. Maybe this even happened during the sack of Winterfell, if the Boltons planned to kill him regardless of the deal, meaning that everything that happened next could be unchanged from the given story. However, if we want to take this further, maybe Rickon is dead, or not actually on Skagos, magical dreams notwithstanding, and Wex is just lying, deliberately leading Wyman on, feeding information back to Ramsay, who knows what's going on and is setting a trap for Wyman. When the Manderlys and Freys leave Winterfell, it won't be the Manderlys who spring the surprise on the Freys, but the other way round, and the Boltons will join the Freys to crush the Manderly forces, before going on to defeat Stannis, skin Mance Rayder alive, send Jon Snow the pink letter, which is completely accurate, and unlock the bad ending to A Song of Ice and Fire, where all the evil guys win. And of course, Wex is the hooded man. I mean, it's obvious, right? I feel I don't need to explain that one, we're all on the same page here. Specifically page 473 of the fanfiction I've scrawled into my black mold covered walls. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this descent into conspiracy. Let me know in the comments your Wex theories, whether complete tinfoil or completely 100% true. Thanks to those who left some on the last video. 5 points to you both. Until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.